So Sheila was born in India, and she took a bachelor's in mathematics at Radcliffe before traveling to Bonn in Germany to do a master's in linguistics, then returning to Harvard to do a PhD in linguistics, followed by a JD at the law school. And she actually practiced environmental law for a number of years in Boston before taking a job up in Cornell together with her husband Jay, and really becoming a pioneer in the new field of science and technology studies, creating the program there, the department, which was the first to be established the other night in the United States.
What did he say? Did he say that Cornell was the first STS department that was established in the US? No.
At a major research university, yes, but
Right,
not the
so
first department.
Not the first
At a major
department.
research institution. Okay. Sheila founded and directs the program on Science, Technology, and Society at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, where she's been for the last almost 20 years. I was. First as a professor of public policy, and then as a four-timer professor of science and technology studies. As you all know, her research focuses on science and the state in contemporary democratic societies. It spans the US, the UK, the EU, Germany, India, and other emerging global regimes in areas having to do with biotechnology and climate, among other things. One of Sheila's lines of work demonstrates how the political culture of different democratic societies influences the ways in which they assess evidence and expertise in policymaking. Her first book, which was called Controlling Chemicals, in 1985, looked at the regulation of toxic substances in the US, Germany, and the UK, and it showed how the routines of decision making in these countries reflected different conceptions of what counts as evidence and how expertise should operate in a policy context. In Designs on Nature, Science and Democracy in Europe and the United States, which is a later book, 2005, Sheila explored how different societies employ different modes of public reasoning when making decisions involving science and technology. These differences, she argued, reflected in part what she called distinct civic epistemologies, and showed quite convincingly that they are deeply embedded in institutions, and shape how policy issues are framed and processed by the bureaucratic machinery of the modern state. Sheila has also contributed to the scholarship in the interaction between science and law. She wrote a book in 1995 called Science at the Bar, which some of you are probably familiar with, which really reached beyond the prevailing diagnoses of structural incompatibilities between science and the law to explore more carefully how these socially embedded institutions interact and to a certain extent mutually constitute each other. The concept of regulatory science, conducted for the purpose of meeting legally mandated standards, and the boundary drawing activities of science advisory committees were analyzed in another book called The Fifth Branch, which came out in 1990. And more generally, in her work on science and law, as well as her research on science and in the state, she takes an approach that links ideas from constitutional law, political theory, and science studies to consider the constitutional role of science in modern democratic societies. She's also worked on global contexts. Examples include her work on the transnational aspects of the Bhopal disaster, an important and really interesting book called Learning from Disaster, which came out in 1994. As well as her research on the formation and politics of global scientific advisory bodies, such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and her research on national and global environmental movements. Sheila, finally, is the founder of the Science and Democracy Network, which is a group of scholars interested in the study of science and the state in democratic society, which has been meeting annually since 2002. Her research has been recognized with a number of awards, including the Bernal Prize from the 4S and a Guggenheim Fellowship. It's a great pleasure to have Sheila and Jay still here in Israel for a bit longer, and a double pleasure to have you returning to our community. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Oren, for having excelled in producing the longest no introduction needed introduction I've ever heard in my life. It's a bit sort of surreal. Somebody else did all that, but I'm me, and I'm glad to be here. Nice to meet all of you, and re-meet some of you. It's late in the day. I've already taught nearly 3 hours in the Tel Aviv Law School, so this is going to be a little bit plus it was all rather hurriedly planned, as you know. So it's going to be a little bit of mix and match, a little bit of delving into more detail into some of the things that Oren was talking about, and then I'm very happy to introduce Hilton Simmet, who's been working with me for the last few years from Harvard undergraduate to now about to be PhD student, but in between he's been doing field work with a project that I'm doing at the Kennedy School at the moment that elaborates on the idea of socio-technical imaginaries. So it's a little bit of how a conceptual idea can spawn new research and go into further theoretical elaboration along lines that I've been thinking about for some time. And I hope that when we come to the discussion, that is, you'll forgive the work in progress character, and we'll go in more detail into some of what's at stake in developing the conceptual side of STS. So one little point for starters, as I'm sure many of you already know, STS has often been caricatured, criticized, taken to task for being a field that is only empirical, only descriptive, not normative, having nothing to say about the problems of the real world, giving back to scientists what they already know in abstruse terms that nobody can understand, being case study focused, and basically being a worthless field, and therefore fully deserving of its non-field character. So I happen to believe radically the opposite on most of those points, and I want to, you can see the whole talk as in part a demonstration of that non-belief, if you will. All right, so I asked Oren what I should talk about, and he said Imaginaries, socio-technical imaginaries. So I took him at his request. But I want to put it a little bit in historical context. Why am I working on socio-technical imaginaries at the moment? How does it relate to some of the other earlier work, particularly the comparative stuff? Because to me, I think methodologically, the comparative work has been pretty much central in pointing out some of the directions at the intersection of political studies and science studies, which I see as, in a sense, my particular contribution to the field. So, Oren already mentioned Controlling Chemicals. It's a book that hardly anybody in STS has ever read or even knows the existence of, even though if anybody bothered to do an intellectual history of this person called Jasanoff, they wouldn't go there because it was the place where I discovered many things about science studies without knowing that a field of sociology of science existed in parallel and side by side. It was a research project about which my political science colleagues said it was exceedingly boring and would never find out anything because the independent variables could not lead to any interesting variation in the dependent variable because they were all the same. So this was a comparative study of the three countries already mentioned, lots of four, France, Germany, Britain, and the US, on how they regulate cancer-causing chemicals, carcinogens. And as I say, my political science colleagues said you will find nothing interesting because these are all democratic countries, they all have highly developed chemical industries, they're all committed to protecting public health, they have the same kinds of expert communities, they have a research base, so they will end up regulating chemicals in the same way, or if there's any variation, it will simply reflect the differences in the power of the chemical industry, and that's all that you will find. Well, that was not all that we found. In fact, we found many interesting differences in the fact that the same evidence, the same group of studies, the same literature was used to draw radically different conclusions about the properties of different chemicals. So even a question that we usually commit to nature, is a chemical a carcinogen or not, ended up being evaluated differently as a result of stuff that I then had to begin thinking about. And, you know, in a sense, that thinking opened the door to all of my subsequent research. If you're historians or historically minded and are interested in the chronology at all, my first STS piece, my first article in Social Studies of Science, came out in 1987, and this book, Controlling Chemicals, came out in 1985, and I think that that reflects a little bit of the discovery of STS as an adjunct to, or an add-on to, what I was already doing when I was working with a couple of political scientists. So to the extent that I cut my teeth somewhere, it was more by working as a lawyer with political scientists and then discovering the STS dimensions, and not through coming into an STS program and having some sense of science studies at that time. So, not surprisingly, some of that early work did not actually problematize the things that we as STS scholars would think to problematize today. It remains, the Controlling Chemicals book remains a fairly structural book, and it didn't look in detail at the connection between epistemic cultures and political cultures. That came later as I evolved that work further. So, you know, political structures and their epistemic assumptions were not really looked at in great detail. I had to go through, I mean, it's part of the life history of being an STS scholar that we all spent a lot of time trying to get somebody to accept that you're actually worth your keep and somebody ought to hire you. And so I supported myself on soft money at Cornell for something like 8 or 9 years before the university actually gave me a tenured position, and at that time without a department because they couldn't figure out what department to put me into. But that took a certain amount of time, and during that time, of course, I had to do research based on who would give me a grant to do that research in. So I didn't come back to the comparative work in a serious way until the 2005 book, Designs on Nature, where I finally felt freed up enough to do whatever I wanted to do, because now I have this established trajectory that I could fall back upon. So within that time, things had changed, and these emerging problems of the 2010s were things that people were talking about, and people were asking, well, how do these things matter? If you're entirely a political structuralist, as many political scientists are, then you actually don't know how to deal with the rise of translocal movements or phenomena, such as privatization or globalization for that matter, and you don't really know. I mean, actually, I took some of these bullet points out of a presentation I made even before 2008, let alone before 2016, and I already had loss of trust and diffusion of responsibility as things I was talking about before the present phenomenon of 2016 came into play. So how does one actually well, how does one refresh one's theoretical apparatus to take account of things that were ruled out of view by the prior framings and by disciplinary lenses at the time? How does one, in short, go back to doing comparative political theory or comparative politics with a strong dose of STS in mind? And that, I think, is one way that you can think of the current work. So why imaginaries at all, and in particular sociotechnical imaginaries? I'll just say as a bracket that a bunch of scholars across a fairly wide range of fields have been talking about imaginaries, but interestingly, all of that work pretty much does not analyze science and technology. The most famous proponent of the word imaginaries is Charles Taylor in political theory, and you will read hundreds of pages of his stuff, and there's no analysis of science and technology, just isn't there. So modern social imaginaries happened out of stuff, but there's no understanding that maybe science and technology had anything to do with that evolution. So I think that there's a real need and a niche for our field to say something about that. So in the very first little essay that I did developing the idea of sociotechnical imaginaries, we had a definition, and because I was working on cross-national comparison, the word national is in there, but I'll come back to that. What I wanted to point out is that all imaginaries may be collectively held and, be some sense, some projection into the future, but that these pick up on ideas of science and technology that then become salient to how we imagine good futures and non-good futures to be. Some of that work focused in on innovation. So just as controversies are a site for looking more deeply at epistemic stakes that people have, you can look at innovation as a site where the normative imaginations of worlds are at stake, because at those moments of renewal, the question, what are you renewing anyway? What are you running away from? What are you projecting into the future? These come into play and become salient. So descriptively, what accounts for these differences, whereas previously I was working on national regulatory strategies, these national innovative strategies or innovation strategies become a new place for the political theoretical inquiry to go, and what accounts for differences in the ways in which people understand innovation. So some of my regulatory work was obviously already pointing in that way. Why is it that America has accepted agricultural biotechnology without hardly raising a fuss, whereas the entire rest of the world thinks that agricultural biotechnology ought to be treated with considerable suspicion, disregard, refusal, protests, and so forth? So it is not the case that just because somebody invents a new scientific thing, everybody falls in line and says, let us accept it and pick it up in that way. And increasingly in my work, I think in contradistinction to a good deal of the other work in STS, the normative questions for me are front and center. And so, what is this idea of good societies about anyway? How do democracies matter? Those are sort of some of the questions that I think lie back of the desire to take up imaginaries as a theoretical framework. So there have been a couple of definitions, and I just want to point out things that have changed. So I never thought that collectively held imaginations had to be at the nation-state level. It just happens to be the level on which a lot of my comparative work has been done, but I've discovered how the rest of the world is eager to take things in the narrowest formulation, and people kept saying, oh, but do imaginaries have to be national? And so anyway, in the new version, the book, we explicitly got rid of the word national, so people wouldn't say that anymore and would instead focus on what work the concept is doing and not what is the level at which it's defined. So The newer definition, not surprisingly, is a bit longer, a bit more elaborate. And what's important to me in that new definition is that the idea of performance is made explicit. I mean, I've always thought that for a long time anyway, but that these visions of desirable futures are not self-executing, that they need constant replay. This is the institutional side of my analytic work anyway. And, you know, the sort of embed and are embodied as opposed to attainable through and supportive of, or not, as the case may be. I mean, so it can be plus or minus, as the case may be. I'm supporting myself, so don't worry about it. All right, so the new book in which some of this is spelled out, especially the introductory theoretical chapters, Dreamscapes of Modernity, to some extent I look at these edited books of mine as ersatz textbooks in a way, because I'm never going to have the patience to write a textbook. But one way of accomplishing the same work is to write the theoretical framework and then let other people work with it and produce chapters that are about different empirical materials. So if you look at my collection of edited volumes, you will find that pretty much all of them contain a theoretical introduction by me and then chapters by other people. Sometimes I've written a chapter of my own, but it's not always the case. And then the chapters are very eclectic. So in Dreamscapes of Modernity, we have a chapter on Cecil Rhodes, and we have a chapter on the Indonesian internet. And, you know, in most disciplines, you would not find the Cecil Rhodes person talking to the internet person ever at all, because people tend to define themselves very topically, and one would be seen as history and colonialism and empire studies, and another would be seen as high-tech and new and emerging technology studies. Even the Society for Nano and Emerging Technologies, I don't think would ever allow the Cecil Rhodes person to come to their annual meeting. But for me, these edited volumes are a way of showing how STS work and STS ideas can work across a wide array of temporally situated, spatially situated, and so forth, research projects, and how they come together at a conceptual level that is then richer because of that very amalgamation of points of view and empirical knowledges that are not all focused on, you know, like gene editing or whatever. It does have risks. If anybody wants to talk about that, I will be happy to. So the research project that I'm doing at the moment is called the Traveling Imaginaries Project, and this is what Hilton has been involved in as well. So if imaginaries are going to be a robust concept, and if they deal with innovation, then we should be able to say something about innovation policies using this idea of imaginaries to some effect. And do imaginaries travel from one place to another, particularly in an era of globalization? This is obviously a question. And if you look at countries or cities or localities or regions that are today doing innovation, it's almost always about importing somebody else's best practices to make one's own innovation culture stronger. So in putting together this project, which is funded by the NSF, in America, we decided to look at 3 such traveling imaginaries, 3 ideas of how to do imagination well, how to do innovation well, that have drawn upon examples from somewhere else. The first one is the MIT model, which stands more broadly for institutes of technology, educational institutions that are dedicated to taking basic science ideas and translating them into inventions that are socially useful and, above all, economically productive. So from discovery to invention. And in medicine in particular, there's a whole array of language now for referring to especially that movement. So bench to bedside, where bench is the lab, but bedside is the place where the innovation is actually applied, and translational medicine also picks up on that idea, but it's much broader than just biomedicine, and entire political cultures see themselves as relatively good or relatively bad at either one endpoint or the other, or at the translation in between. The UK, for instance, has historically seen itself for many decades as being extremely good at bench and extremely bad at translation. So, Trinity College, more Nobel laureates than the rest of the world put together, they always say. But of course they count back very far. But in any case, but no industries, no large industries that have developed out of that scientific genius that was in the Cavendish lab and so forth. So countries have their own analyses of where they're failing, and some people localize it in the absence of this thing called an MIT or some model of that sort. The second one that is, of course, more powerful than almost any other one at the moment is Silicon Valley. Everybody who wants to do innovation successfully wants the Silicon Valley model. And the book that is going to be coming out of this project, as opposed to individual articles, will be focused probably on this Silicon Valley model and what it has come to mean in different places, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's interesting how Silicon Valley has already undergone various philological transformations. So Silicon Fen is the joking term that the city of Cambridge, UK has taken for itself because it's situated in Fenland. Here you already have the Silicon Wadi and the Silicon Corridor that the Germans talk about, from Heidelberg to Karlsruhe and maybe even to Munich. So you have transformations of what the geography of the silicon has to be to produce the desired kind of entrepreneurial culture. And then public engagement is the third of these traveling imaginaries. So you got it from the bench into an invention, you got the invention commercialized and into the market, and now you have to get people to accept it. How to avoid the GMO debacle is something that is in the minds of most technological innovators that I know. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been at where people are developing, synthetic biology or various other kinds of new technologies, and they're always saying we have to avoid a new GMO controversy. So, it's like that has become an imagination of how not to have the wrong kind of public uptake and the wrong kind of democracy. So in designing the research project, we had to pick places that we would look at and rationales for picking those places. So I decided
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Going back to your last slide, are those, are you talking about distinct models, or is this more sort of a focus on different stages of the process of translation?
I mean, I've decided to put it as stages to rationalize it further, but they are seen as policy models. I mean, that is, policymakers say they want to bring more MIT into their educational cultures. So in a moment I'll tell you what cities we're looking at, but each of those cities has a particular kind of relationship with MIT or the idea of MIT. Mm-hmm. And I'll explain that in a minute. Everybody wants to incorporate aspects of Silicon Valley, and it is actually a modeling that, what makes Silicon Valley work, and we want to bring that in. It so happens that, in order to justify it to NSF, I put a chronological or phase spin onto it, mm-hmm. but that doesn't take away from the fact that these are concurrent and that policy people are writing laws or creating incentive structures to bring about more of, one or another of these things. And they're not necessarily interdependent. So the research sites, as I say, I decided to get away from the national and onto the city, in part because national policy making is in quite a lot of trouble, as you know, at the moment. And there's a lot of pendulum swing back and forth, and a real feeling that some of the best social innovation is happening not at the level of the nation state, but at the level of cities and regions, and particularly cities, because there's such a mix of different kinds of problems that are microcosmic in a way. And as research sites, they're more manageable in some way than trying to, cover nation states with this kind of project. So the cities we've picked are Boston, Cambridge, UK, Munich, and Bangalore. And just to give a little bit more answer to your point before, Oren, so MIT, Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor of the UK, he loved MIT. I mean, he thought he was a Scot, he is a Scot, and had a certain kind of fondness for America. He has a place on Cape Cod, and when he came to America, he was very struck at the way that the MIT culture had permeated the region, the Boston region, and seemed to account for productivity, not just in Boston, but also through networks and ties around the country. MIT itself boasts that part of its spin-off culture is responsible for some of the work around Silicon Valley, and then how to bring it back becomes a bit of a question. So Gordon Brown actually orchestrated a partnership between the University of Cambridge and MIT, threw public money at it. And this was this forced marriage. I mean, it was really like an arranged marriage. It was supposed to produce a generation of UK innovators who could, like the MIT innovators, be better at taking their inventions out into the marketplace and creating successful industries and successful technologies, instead of just winning Nobel Prizes and keeping their medals at home. So, I mean, this is one of the most explicit efforts to take a university as a model and actually bring it in. But, if you look at the history of India, the entire network of Indian institutes of technology was also modeled on various institutes of technology in other places, and the most successful one ecologically turned out to be the MIT model. So you can see India's engineering education system, as having capitalized on the MIT model only decades earlier, and now, of course, that historical displacement creates some difficulties and frictions in India's ability to translate ideas into invention. All right, so the methods, comparison, of course, I've already talked about and will again, but also participant observation and all the standard qualitative lit review kinds of strategies. And what I want to point out is that these cities were chosen because there's a set of structured similarities and differences that allow for something that I call comparative problematization, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then these cities, so I've mostly done north-north or west-west comparisons before, but because if you want to trace flows of things, today it's not obvious where the north is or where the south is, and so having Bangalore in the mix explicitly was a bow to that observation. So, of course, good social science fields always say they're doing the new something, and STS says it does the new materialism, which I find quite boring. But I think that we could talk about STS as new institutionalism, because I think STS is transforming, or can be transforming, institutional studies and the sociological understandings of institutionalism in certain important ways, and I think that the comparative method is one of those ways. I've been talking about why STS scholars should use comparison more in a lot of my work. And I think we can say something about the why compare that is not trivial. So first of all, I want to stress that I take comparison as not only being cross-national, but also cross-sectoral and cross-temporal. I also want to say that an important purpose of the comparison is to try to figure out why, confronting the same set of phenomena in the world, powerful organizational structures such as nation states see the thing differently. I mean, it's almost like the world is continually throwing up Rorschach tests for society, and what society takes and interprets out of those Rorschach tests is, for us as analysts, a way of looking back into the mentality or the thought process or the structures of that society to get an idea of why are they interpreting it in this way. And I think that that's a very general sort of analytic phenomenon. For me, it goes to certain basic theoretical questions, like, today we might pessimistically be decrying the disappearance of the public sphere. I mean, at times it seems not to be existing at all. But what do we think of as the divide between the public and the private, and how do we think about that? This is a kind of phenomenon that I think this kind of comparative approach allows us to take on board seriously. Situatedness, so of course, STS scholars are all familiar with Donna Haraway's ideas of situated knowledge, but one can take it further, and what causes things to become sticky as opposed to what allows for flows. It's one of the kinds of things that I think this project allows us to approach. I've written a couple of pieces that I won't talk about in detail, but one of them is a short piece on different national imaginaries of the energy transition and what it will involve. And if you look at the different energy systems that are being looked at in my usual three comparison countries, UK, Germany, and the US, one of the things that pops out at you is how differently the risks and benefits are being conceptualized, so how the public-private boundary is being drawn in relation to managing the risks and benefits of these technologies. So in the German case, benefits may be privatized, but risks very definitely have to be taken on board as part of a collective enterprise. Whereas if you look in America, the benefits are being privatized, but the risks are being socialized in the sense that the nation state is picking up the risks, often silently. So if you ask who paid the costs of various huge debacles that we have, it turns out we, the taxpayers, the nation state, but without acknowledgement. And you can see this in the energy domain, in the principles behind the Price-Anderson Act that said Westinghouse can get the benefits, but we will pick up the catastrophic risks. And in the financial meltdown, you can look at like Stieglitz's work, and he will say the same thing about how we've privatized the benefits and socialized the risks. This is not the approach taken in the German case, where you have to show that the state is taking collective responsibility for the risks explicitly, often through legislation or constitutional decision-making, before the private sector can even be allowed to go on with its risky activities. And in this particular work, my co-editor, Sang-Hyun Kim, worked with me, so we included the Korean case. These are tables that have appeared in various work, and given the time, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I just want to show how you can operationalize abstract concepts. So, of course, the countries, if that's the level that you're comparing at, form the columns, but you can see how the project of comparative problematization leads to interesting differences in how the policy focus in relation to the same set of technological developments works out differently. So you're talking about nuclear power, and where is the US policy focus? Over and over again, it's on controlling radiation, whereas the South Korean case, which is, by the way, similar to Japan before Fukushima, was on developing national capacity and energy sufficiency, and radiation hazards were really swept under the carpet because this other aim was felt to be far more significant. And in Germany, the worry has been that this is a kind of technology that, you know, in a sense, it's like all the Germans had Red Langdon Winner. They had, but you know, it reflected the thinking that this was a closed technology and you know, artifacts of politics, and you know, and you need the transparency because nuclear power inherently is a kind of anti-democratic technology. You need to open it up. I believe that these cross-national divergences, and for that matter the cross-city ones, are not accidental. There's political institutional underpinnings, and this sort of table, which again, you know, I don't have to talk about in enormous detail, but it illustrates what are the institutional foundations, the relative stickiness of institutions that keeps some of these meta or epiphenomena in place when it comes to doing policy. Because I'm interested in law, I'm particularly interested in the constitutional cultures of the countries that I study, and they are quite different. So what the state-to-citizen settlement is felt to be in the countries that I study, in what way? I mean, everybody's democratic state is responsible to citizens, but in what way, and what is being expected of the citizen or not? These vary in a quite nuanced way. We know many sort of trivializations that show how people are aware of this. I mean, so I don't know how many times in the course of my research I've heard lawyers who should know better say things like, well, in America everything is forbidden, everything is permitted unless it's expressly forbidden. In Germany, everything is forbidden unless it's expressly permitted. To me, okay, there's a certain amount of truth in this, but what's more interesting is how everybody accepts it as a characterization of their culture. I mean, so, you know, there are these sort of constitutional understandings that I think play an important part in the evolution of technological systems. All right, so now I want to make a quick, so all of that was why Imaginaries, what's the payoff, how does it fit? I haven't even used the word co-production, but I think Imaginaries are an instrumentality in a way of co-production. They allow us to show why worlds are being imagined in particular ways, in whole ways that tie together in these institutionally underpinned formations. So now I want to do a quick turn to Bangalore. And I want to say, first of all, that when I arrived in Bangalore myself to do a week's worth of field work, but obviously based on long prior knowledge of the city and to some degree obviously deeper knowledge about India, the thing that everybody was talking about was this. They weren't talking about Bangalore being an innovation city. They were talking about the steel flyover controversy. I had heard about it back in the States already because some of my friends work at the Graduate School of Design, and one of them happens to be a South Asian, and she was talking about this as a big planning controversy in India at the moment. So first of all, it sounds odd. It's not just a matter of Indian English versus English English. The steel flyover controversy, it's weird. So why steel? That was one of the puzzles. Why not the concrete flyover controversy or the highway I-92 controversy? What's at stake in this word steel? And what was the thing anyway? So it was meant to be a bridge that was going to connect the city to the airport, and that's important to keep in mind. City and airport. And it was going to cost a good deal of money. In India, 1,800 crores has a radically different sign, valence, than $3 million. If you say a public works project is going to cost $3 million, that's the worth of a day of corruption in Boston. So, it's nothing. We're talking, unless you talk billions, you're not in the ballpark in America. So nevertheless, this was seen as a highly costly intervention to build this 6.7 kilometers. And there were allegations of corruption, you know, who was getting the bids and why, and the political party was being paid off. Interestingly, 812 trees were going to be chopped down, and this became a real focus of controversy, just as much as the total cost of the project. And citizens mobilized, and they said many of them were mobilizing for the very first time, and the biggest demonstrations called out something like 10,000 people protesting this flyover. And ultimately, the Congress Party retreated, and so just before I arrived in March earlier this year, they abandoned it. Here is just an artist's depiction of what the thing would have looked like. So I was thinking, why steel? And I don't think that's a spelling error. So, you know, it was somehow the materiality was implicated in the thing, but I think it would be quite erroneous to say, let's follow the steel and somehow we'll get to, you know, actor network theory in pure form, and that will just open our eyes. I mean, I think there's something going on in the project where the imagination focuses on the misuse of this, what is seen as expensive building material, for this illegitimate purpose of connecting the city to the airport. Give us the train instead. So what's the difference between the road and the train? You know, so you see how technologies are implicated into ways of life, and people don't want the high-end, expensive, purified material of steel to be wasted on the people who are going to the airport, as opposed to the train that everyday citizens would benefit from. And this is happening in a period of enormous growth in Bangalore, so that people who used to live closer to the city center can't afford to be there anymore. They've been driven to the periphery. They have no way to go into work in the central city. So for them, trains and buses are the obvious answers, not this flyover, which is not for them. And literally then flyover attains a metaphoric status because it's about flight and it's over, and it's not about the people on the ground wanting to do their thing. Why the 870, what was that number? 872? 812, sorry, trees. Well, this was an organization that formed to save Bangalore's trees and, you know, consult the public before any trees are cut for road widening around Palace Grounds, Bellary Road, and or the steel flyover project. But you have to recognize that Bangalore was seen historically as a garden city, and it's still very green compared with many inner cities in India, let alone in the West. And there are these enormous shade trees, a sort of umbrella-like shape of the trees is very characteristic of the Bangalore landscape. And this is a picture which it calls to mind sort of nostalgic images of Harvard Yard when the elms still existed. A reference that is meaningful, obviously, to me and to other old-timers, but the very first citizen protest I knew about probably was mobilizing to preserve the sycamore trees along the banks of the Charles. I mean, so certain kinds of treescapes have this patterning to them that people were obviously very excited about. And then one of the major public interest groups, one in which Hilton actually interned, helped develop the technical case, but also the political case against the project. And, you know, going back to the public-private thing, you hear the actors themselves are talking about the public-private boundary. I mean, you don't have to make it up. This is in the discussion of the people, that the project, the steel flyover, is not just a personal one taken up to benefit some select people who are not the ordinary citizens of Bangalore. Okay, so the ordinary citizens who have local democracy, public engagement, you see how of our three traveling imaginaries, they're all implicated in one another. The public engagement is very much tied to this. So if I want to take the steel flyover project and integrate it into the comparative framework, I should note that it won't necessarily fit into the direct structure of the NSF project, something that NSF doesn't understand, but I hope you all do, that to some extent the findings dictate where the richness of the methods goes. And if I had to find a place where to draw interesting comparative highlights from the Bangalore steel flyover controversy, I would look at Stuttgart 21, of course keeping in mind that Germany is another of the countries that I'm interested in, so a German example. Stuttgart 21 was a decades-long, at least a decade and a half long, controversy about this building, which may look to some of you like a brutalist structure, and it is, but somehow people got suddenly very attached to it. It is the Stuttgart Hauptbahnhof, the main station of the city of Stuttgart, which has the characteristic that it's a so-called end station because the trains stop there, and therefore trains cannot go through. Cannot go through might remind you of the steel flyover. That is, it's a kind of passage to a particular kind of passenger and a particular kind of transport, in particular the ICEs, the high-speed international, transnational trains that currently cannot go through Stuttgart. And the plan, Stuttgart 21, 21st century, was to turn the Stuttgart main station into this high-tech creation, all glass and, more like the Berlin main station, if some of you have seen that, with the train zipping through. And the Stuttgart citizens mobilized heavily against that. And you could ask, why more than 15 years of controversy? And in contrast to Bangalore and that little proof that I gave you, where it is felt that the public has not been consulted, the governors of the state of Baden-Württemberg, where Stuttgart is located, the ruling groups, said, we have consulted till we're blue in the face. This is Germany. We're consulting you all the time. We have 15 years of every kind of hearing, every kind of report, all transparency all the way down. Everybody's had their opinion heard. You've had umpteen opportunities to come forward. And this is like, at the end of the day, you're complaining about the most democratic planning process that anybody could conceivably have imagined. And they could not make sense of why people showed up. And, we're not talking negligible numbers. At its height, the Stuttgart 21 protest about this train station drew 50,000 people into the streets. And when I visited Tübingen around that time, everybody was talking about that. They were mobilizing, against the station. And what was one of the focal points? It was trees. So in the Schloss Park, the palace grounds, something on the order of 300 trees were going to be cut down. And everybody had buttons and, all kinds of paraphernalia signaling their support for these trees. I mean, you see why I think the comparison would be salient. And their argument, the protesters' argument, was you're getting the democracy point backward. You gave us an already framed problem. You said here was this train station that had to be remodeled, and how are we going to do it? Whereas we want to question the imaginary to start with. What kind of city is Stuttgart, and what kind of traffic should it be tolerating that you should need to enable this new construction in the first place? So they said that if the initial frame was flawed, then any kind of democratic process that comes after just doesn't mean anything. You're asking the wrong question and then gearing democracy around that. So the solution that the government came up with, which we have since learned is the solution of all pusillanimous political leaders, make it a referendum. So they made it a referendum, and some 60% of the people said that they should not now withdraw the funding. And this was taken by the proponents as a sign that they had won and the public now supported them. The opponents keep saying no, because basically you told people there are some costs and it's going to be more expensive to stop this project than to go forward with it, so you're still not giving us a choice. The can has been kicked down the road and kicked down the road. The estimated cost is now, I think, 2 doublings over the original estimate. But the government still wants to go ahead. But in the meantime, the politics change. The Greens, this is a relatively conservative, rightward-leaning state. The Greens suddenly came into power, and Baden-Württemberg now has a coalition government of the Christian Democrats and the Greens, and it's not obvious what's going to happen with this project. So, you see something of these sociotechnical imaginaries, at work in ways, but this is, because it's work in progress, I can't tell you in detail what this comparison will fully do for me as yet. In the meantime, back in India, of course, there is a power figure of a sort we recognize all too well. His idiosyncrasies do not express themselves in tweets so much as, I'm tempted to say tweeds, except I don't think this is a tweed. When he met Obama, he was dressed in a suit that had little stripes, but when you look closely, it says Narendra Modi. I mean, that is, his name was woven into the fabric, and so he is a dapper conservative. And what he has wanted to foster in India is a culture of make in India, as it's called, and there are people who are quite skeptical about whether there is anything new in Modi's make in India. But I think it fits into a sort of innovation culture, across the board, because innovation is a big buzzword in India at the moment. So one place that we went to visit was an incubator, which was in part begun by a distinguished Harvard Business School colleague of mine named Tarun Khanna, who's there. And part of why he wanted an incubator was he said that the Indian government had invested a lot of money into incubators, but they had not performed, and he wanted to do this right. So he wanted to do this with proper experimental foundations, with feedback, and were things succeeding or not. So in that sense, it was a private sector idea coming. So Tarun has his PhD, I think, from Princeton, or his undergraduate from Princeton and his PhD from Harvard. Anyway, he's American educated and a professor at Harvard Business School. So his idea of what counts as rectifying the nation state's failures is to set up a private company. And the CEO of that company is a guy who had his prior managerial experience at one of India's most successful high-tech emerging technology firms, namely Infosys. And Hilton and I went and had a very nice conversation with him. And one of the things he was really very taken with is that he got to run this Axelor from the ground up and to be involved in every stage of its design. So he really was exhilarated at having come out of this large company, even though it's a high-tech company, and being in this incubator where he got to make decisions like the design of these tables. So when their incubator people come and have their startup conversations, they sit at the tables, and he pointed out how the flaps can be folded down so it can become different shapes, and they stick their ideas on, big signs that they attach to those things. And if you've been in mediated conferences in an American type of context, you will recognize a certain kind of corporate speech and corporate think in how you generate ideas, how you collectivize notions, lots of small group exchanges, the informality of not writing things on a board, but on flip charts and tear sheets that you put all over the place. And he was really excited that he was getting to design the very space of innovation from the ground up. that was something that he had not experienced in his previous job. And towards the end of our visit, he said that he really wanted to show us one place, which was the outdoor place where they gather together for their social functions, these future incubators in India, or I don't know what, maybe there should be a separate noun for the person who makes an incubatorer, but anyway, but he was very proud of this word start. And of course that's referring to the startup culture, and he wanted very much that we should carry away that startup culture with us. So the imagination is of a startup, but one can talk a little bit about the infrastructures that are implicated in the steel flyover project as opposed to the infrastructures that are implicated in the startup culture's imaginary of what India needs now. So partly it's the social networks. So what are the connections that Axelor has in place? And during our interview, Mr. Venugopal spoke repeatedly, almost presenting a deficit model of the would-be innovator, that he kept saying, here are the missing things. And I kept trying to push him a little bit on how he even knew what were the missing things, but he didn't give me a social science answer. He didn't say, here are the Harvard Business School studies that show that, you need the following 10 things on the ground. This was more, tacit knowledge. But, one can't help noticing that someone like Khanna brings the entire apparatus of the Harvard Business School, into this place, and it's a set of, connections and understandings. And Bangalore's information society networks, I don't know how many times we heard, even in the week that I was there, about how Bangalore is now a magnet, drawing various people in, people traveling from all over India. So, not surprisingly, Bengalis, of whom I am one, but Calcutta is a place where nothing happens and things have been in status since almost independence, and so all the Bengalis are either Nobel Prize winning or would be Nobel Prize winning economists working in America, or they're in Bangalore doing high-tech stuff. So Bangalore is being a magnet, and so the ordinary people of Bangalore, whom you saw referred to in the steel flyover, are not the people who are part of the innovation culture that have been brought together in this way. So,
which is different from Gujarat, right? Very different from Gujarat.
It's very different from Gujarat, partly because Gujarat has been the commercial leader of India, the West Coast in general, for a very long time. So, but they don't have the technical infrastructure. So, to some extent, southern India has had a deeper and longer standing engagement with education.
Mm-hmm.
And Gujarat has not to that extent. So Bangalore is today capitalizing on a set of investments, but it's capitalizing in a way that looks to a different idea of for whose benefit is innovation. So you talk to these startup people, and next $1 million company is something. So the idea of the $1 million company came up often and has come up often in other conversations I've had as well. But the company is a disembodied thing. It's not where is the train service that's going to take me to work. Mm-hmm. Or when we went to another NGO, the guy we were supposed to meet was constantly late or not there, and the day that I was there, he showed up for like 2 minutes at the end. Why? Because he was off in the Chief Minister's office, having received a call, the Chief Minister of the state of Karnataka, having received a call that you must show up today. And he said he had been there all morning for the sake of a 5-minute interaction with that Chief Minister. And what he was wanting is both an increase in the size of the bus network and a reduction in the price per capita for riding the bus. And we said, did you succeed? And he said the Chief Minister's assistant, to whom he talked, said he's prepared to think about increasing the network but not decreasing the fare. But this is what an NGO is thinking about on a daily basis, as opposed to what my incubator people are thinking about on a daily basis. And start as opposed to improve or build again or whatever. So, that India is a large enough market to service India is one of the things that we also heard, and Tarek Khanna has set up a way of bypassing, in a way, placement services. I mean, it was interesting to see to what extent the innovation skills are being targeted to matching people to jobs. This has obviously become a sector, sort of industrial sector of its own. And Khanna has started apparently quite a successful concern that allows people to get tested in whatever skill set, and set, not just one skill, but package of skills that they consider important to do whatever. So when I was talking to Tarun, who's a friend and colleague, he was saying, so supposing you want to be a home healthcare worker or something like that, you can say, I need these skills, and we will have the standardized tests. We have the standardized tests so that you can go take them and you'll be evaluated, and it's like the GREs, you'll get your answers back, and then you can put on your CV that you had yourself tested and these are your credentials, and this is helping people to find jobs. So I'm a fanatic about equality, he said to me, and what he's trying to do is open the barriers, which of course given India's caste and class system is a non-negligible thing to try to do. But again, it's completely divorced from place. Even this idea of equality, it's like he is imagining the Indian public as if he's looking at it from some God's eye perspective and deciding what the population as a whole needs. In the meantime, people continue to worry about the trees that still fall. And to me, that's a somewhat poignant note to end on, to or at least end this slightly discursive talk on. I think we're finding that the question of innovation, although it's on everybody's lips, is very different looking depending on where in the socioeconomic ladder you're situated, whose imagination, and who has the right to imagine. So my most recent book, The Ethics of Innovation, is about inequality, but inequality in a different way. I mean, I talk about the inequality of the ability to imagine what these futures, what the governing images of the future will be. And I think that in the research that we've been doing, we're finding that that is going to be a place of serious political investigation. I mean, so what kinds of democracies are we constructing? If you really want to get serious about inviting material things into your imagination of democracy and politics, if you want the artifacts to have a place at the table, begin with something like this and ask what place the tree has in the imagination of Stuttgart 21, what place it has in the imagination of Bangalore, the once and future city. And I think what you'll find is that it is a little trivializing to impute intentionality or any kind of agency to the tree. It's much more a sense of, how the past, the present, and the future connect together that happens to be mediated through these kinds of objects. And what has resonance to me is just how powerfully something like a tree resonates still across the different flavors and the different cultures of modernity that we see struggling for primacy in the very confused world order that we're in. So let me stop.
I want to flick the lights on now. All right, so thank you very much, Sheila. It was extremely interesting. Let's open it up to questions. First, students, please. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's actually super relevant for me because I'm following an academic initiative out of MIT, the Fab Lab network that landed here in Israel in a very poverty, harsh neighborhood outside of Tel Aviv. And so I was wondering, the travel imaginary, is it really an expansion of the last stage? You know, in your book, in Social Imaginary, you're talking about the birth of an idea and how it's embedded, and then the controversies. And so the traveling is an extension of the fourth stage, where things are liquefied and across time and space, really. So this is how
but I think, that's exactly right. But I think I've never thought that extension was simple, nor that it's ever complete. So it's partly about the frictions of extension, and I think the reason that I called it resistant imaginaries for today is, how to take seriously the completely countervailing ideas. I didn't have time, unfortunately, to sort of systematically lay out the dimensions of comparison between the people who were protesting the flyover and the people who were creating the incubators. But you see how, the same things are being understood in different ways. How would you create your $1 million company if you didn't have the traffic back and forth between the outside? Where is this market? And yet people who are building the flyovers are living somewhere. This is, a lesson of Brasilia that was imprinted on me a very long time ago when I visited the city, that this brilliant Marxist architect didn't really think where his workers would live while they were building the city. And so the real heart of Brasilia came to be not in the heart, which is, as you know, sort of cruciform, but in the quadrants where people, escaped and set up different things. So, in that same sense, whose infrastructures should be taken seriously, and if you say that there's a kind of parallelism, or that the material infrastructures and the social infrastructures are equally important, which I think any STS scholar would say, it's still the case that for some people the materiality matters more because they're not able to transcend or to go or to fly over. They have to be on the ground. So these importations, like MIT, bump up against different sorts of hard realities. I have a jointly authored article with my colleague Sebastian Pfotenhauer coming out in Social Studies of Science, and it's our joint interpretation of 3 different importations of MIT into different places. Cambridge, which I mentioned today, Portugal, where the state of Portugal made for partnerships with MIT, and also Singapore. And what we say in that piece is that these empirical cases tell us more about the importer's self-diagnosis, that it's almost like a medical, like MIT is a probe, and in bringing this probe into the body politic, the body politic is discerning for itself its own illnesses and is constructing MIT as a therapy to respond to that. It's a little bit maybe artificially sanitized, but I'll be very interested in what you think of it.
Think about that.
Yeah, Eric?
Thank you. Well, actually, I do have comments. First of all, I just want to say that it's a shame that Noach isn't here. Noach Hefron? Noach Hefron, because obviously our work is enormous. Well, we always, for us, the idiom of co-production is like something that we grow on.
Well, I was very sorry to hear that Noach wouldn't be here, especially since being here for 3 weeks is a luxury for me, and I'm getting to see people in a more relaxed way than I sometimes have. So
Definitely.
yeah.
But through him, you're always the work is always present for us to study in this program. It's a really useful concept, and we're thinking about co-production of intellectual and institutional factors and also about the construction of the cells, everything goes together, and a way to avoid falling into pitfalls in a way. And also, personally, I'm sorry that I'm not unfamiliar with your latest book, but I find it fascinating. And the idea of, like if I get it right, the idea that like an elite group has some kind of a monopoly to imagine and to like have a dominant vision of the future, of society's future. And like in the context of my research, it takes me to Paris at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, when you had like a small group of surgeons who constructed the entire science of medicine.
Yeah, no, I mean, those examples are obviously deeply interesting historically, and you know, some of my colleagues in the law school talk about how international law, the whole concept of international law, is a similar construction of a small group of European law people who, in a sense, invented the very idea of what international means, and then applied law to that idea. Yeah, but in order to develop international law, they had to construct all other places in the world as not having international law. So there was this simultaneous construction of the positive thing and its negative counter-image at the same time. Hinton, I don't know if you're awake enough to say anything about the Microsoft people and how they are imagining the social good.
Yes, well, I was actually embedded at the Microsoft Research, which is one of the few sort of corporate offices that, interestingly, like Xerox and IBM and a lot of these places that are within Bangalore have product development sites where they have people that are working on their products. But Microsoft is actually working on having basic research at these sort of locations. And maybe there's one in Tel Aviv, I don't know. But in Bangalore, they focus on things like machine learning, AI, and a lot of really like theoretical like computer science stuff. But they also have a group there that actually started the research that's now done in India, and it's called Technology for Emerging Markets. But when it actually got started, it was a Yale PhD grad and two other people, one who went also worked for Microsoft for some time, and they had brought in social scientists. They brought in someone actually from the Kennedy School at Harvard. They brought in an anthropologist and an economist. And a lot of them were talking about sort of post-colonial theory. You know, they were talking about issues of development and really what is development anyways, and how do we achieve these ends. And sort of over time, Microsoft seems to continue to pour money into that, into Microsoft Research India, or MSRI as they call it, and sort of the institution around the technology for emerging markets cluster has sort of grown. So now it really could compete with a lot of computer science programs and departments, and they do formal academic work and present it at the same conferences as anyone else, but there is this cluster that's still working, only now it looks like there's only one social scientist on the team. There's an architect, designer, and the two others are kind of hardcore. One was a former sort of professor at the Institute of Science, and developed the Simputer, which is basically this device that would basically a tablet that was invented in 2003, like far before a lot of people were using this technology, and with a lot of the same ideas that eventually became what we now think of as the smartphone, and that Steve Jobs got everyone to actually start using. And then another is a MacArthur fellow who graduated from MIT and has a lot of his training and experience there. And what was interesting, just in terms of the historical evolutions of this place, was one of the founders that went on to write a book called Geek Heresy, which is all about how sort of technology and its use in development has been so sort of overwrought and overstated, and that it's almost become a a trope that you launch these computers and one laptop per child, you'll suddenly have a transformation within in a village, like a lot of the ones that you see in India. And he kind of left the group and wrote this book criticizing this, and I think he's now teaching at the University of Michigan. But the others, one of the others who stayed there has kind of now been involved in a similar way, and he's actually quite skeptical that technology does anything. He sort of emphasizes this educational dimension to promoting development in village context. So they have these different things that they're working on, and they have a vision lab, and another thing that I got to see was Microsoft is doing digital villages. So the government of India now, to develop its villages, wants to make them go digital. So this idea that you'll create jobs by training people in basic IT skills, and they'll be able to basically work remotely or go to the cities and then actually get jobs in these areas.
The thing about this, I mean, it's a very rich example of what happens when the elite imagination lands onto territory. So one of the things is that some people have become skeptics, but in a sense the skeptics have gone back out of the place that they were in. I mean, it's not that the skeptical view is staying and engendering a different sort of hybridization in the place. The skeptics have left and the other people have stayed. There's an attrition of the social sciences as other product things get going. I think Hilton, you told me that when the CEO came to town, of Microsoft, he only stayed for like 15 seconds. I mean, it was, just a touchdown and going away, and not a proper feedback loop. But still in all, what they think is needed remains, how to digitize the village, and then it keys into Modi's ideas of, how to, so it's not just smart cities. India has a smart villages program. But neither idea questions what I think we would question to start with. Smart in what respects? I mean, what makes a village smart? Anyway, so if one of the founders of this technology for emerging markets says smartness is not about putting computers and digital capability into the hands of people, that hasn't worked. It worked in something else. Then where is that something else coming from? The flyover people that we talked to, they said what was great about the flyover protest is it brought out first-time protesters, people who had never had civic experience, who had never had the sense that they could actually go out and take a stand against something. And so what they're very eager to do is like what all of the sort of Women's March and Scientist March people are trying to do, and post-Occupy as well. How do we take the tapped-up energy that has revealed itself but doesn't have the institutional places to go to? So I think that is a set of things we have to think about, that it's not only that the elites elsewhere have the resources with which to imagine things that are far beyond the imaginative capability of people who have no access to those technologies. It's also that they have the institutional resources to propagate them, to build collectives around them, to build the kinds of networks that we see with Axelor and the incubator, that the on-the-ground people don't have. I mean, because their resources are political savvy, organizing skills, all of these things that are political skills that are not, they're not the things that are being taught.
And what's interesting in this Teal Flyover case as well, the protest was started by two people who worked for a really long time in the IT and software industry. So there's this excess pool of labor, in fact, that all over Bangalore, you'd see them not just going into things like tech or startups, but they'd also be starting organic farms like outside of the city. So it was spawning an entirely different set of things, in part using some of the excess energy that these people were having not being fulfilled within the sort of strictures of what they were doing, sort of with the CEO of this Axeloid group as well.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well,
Yeah,
please.
thanks. That was fascinating. I have two questions. The first is about the vocabulary or the choice of the word. Imaginary has like the connotation of being a thing that is not real, right? Imagination versus reality. And I was wondering if this choice is intended, why you chose imaginaries as opposed to, let's say, visions, especially when there are people who already accuse the STS of being too postmodern, which seems like a bit playing to their hand. And the second question is about those objects in the center of the case studies, the bridge or the train station. It seems from your description that these objects stand for something else, so that those people are fighting for the bridge not just because they oppose the bridge, but also because the bridge itself symbolizes or stands for something else, some image that they have of themselves, some needs that they think some needs they want to satisfy or think that are not satisfied, and some object suddenly captures the public imagination and becomes the site or the locus of protest or public action. And my question is how, within this theoretical framework, what resources are there to explain why a certain object suddenly captures the imagination? And I say also, I haven't read your recent work yet, so these are questions from ignorance.
Well, the questions from ignorance are sometimes the best ones. They point the author to what is left not adequately explained, and so I welcome such questions. Why the word imaginaries? Well, so first of all, it's been around in the social science literature for a long time. I wrote my first piece with imagination in the title back in the 90s. I wrote a piece called Image and Imagination, which was about the way in which the Earth image was colonizing or influencing, if you want a softer word, the ways in which people collectively think about the Earth's future. And from the early 1970s onward, when you started having these Earth summits of the environment, that Apollo image became the, in a sense, of shorthand for a set of ideas about both the scale at which you should be thinking about environmental problems. I mean, it gave a big impetus to sustainability and planetary thinking, and I think subsequently down the line to the Anthropocene as well, but also at the same time entailed a sort of shift in understanding of responsibility and who is responsible for the environmental future of the Earth, that it isn't, that international no longer is the right framing for thinking about how to get together and ban toxic substances, for instance, that you need something that is higher order. And that, of course, is the co-productionist move, that suddenly you start seeing the problem at a difference in scale in this case, and start thinking about the normativities associated with that as well. So it's not a vision. I mean, there are places in my work, both in the introduction to the Dreamscapes volume and in the website that explicates some of this, where we've tried to pin down, theoretical words that are part of the same family and to some extent distinguishing them. But to you, a philosopher, I don't need to point out that any such enterprise is not to be taken in a positivist way, because it will be like the rope. I mean, there will be areas of overlap, and some people, including myself, may say vision at a time when I'm explicating imaginaries or vice versa. Nevertheless, there's a core, a sort of center of gravity of what a word means, and several people, beginning with Ben Anderson's work on imagined communities, have pointed to the fact that it's a mistake to think of imagination as being about the fictive that's in the head, and everything else being real. That imaginaries, that word, are every bit as much social facts, I mean, you know, that people have together. You know, living here in this country, what does one imagine the future of the country to be in relation to its past? You know, yesterday, as I was telling Anat, we got a guided tour of a part of Israel we had never been in, and our host, who was conducting us, was talking matter-of-factly about, you know, this is the field where the David-Goliath conflict took place, right? And, you know, of course, I'm completely familiar with that in every country I've been in and lived in, however modern it is. I mean, there are places where these things that are like a millennium ago, you know, seem like they're immediate. But capture that.
But that really was where. With due respect.
I was thinking today, I had a brilliant insight. I was thinking today that the idea of the founding fathers having laid down a meaning for the Constitution was every bit as absurd in its way, or, you know, deserving of a theatre of the absurd working out as David and Goliath having fought there, because they're both constitutional imaginations in a way, or constitutional imaginaries. Anyway, so this just a shorthand for why imaginary, and I'm not the only person who uses it, though I firmly take exception to anybody who says, I am drawing on the work of thus and such. I'm typically not. I mean, you know, it's my own views about how to think about these things, and as I say, nobody has taken the obvious point on board that modernist imaginaries have to have a place for science and technology, and we need to work on that. On your second point about the objects and so forth, I'm not sure that one could say why a particular object has that galvanizing or crystallizing quality. But the comparative work does point to interesting things and moments. So at the city scale, we have something like 10 or a dozen people writing chapters about the Silicon Valley imaginary as it has landed in their cities that they're thinking about. It's interesting how in at least half a dozen of those, a road becomes one of these attractive points. Now, when you think about it, of course, it's not surprising because cities, you know, it's a truism that mayors' fates, city mayors in America, rise and fall on whether they can fix potholes and shovel the snow off in the Northeast anyway, from Boston to Chicago. So streets have, I mean, they're built into the lives of cities. I mean, they're where the city has its origin in a way. I mean, you know, you go to Pompeii or you go to Mohenjo-Daro. I mean, you know, the street is one of those places. So I think that that's work for cultural history to some extent and not explanatory social science. I think it's more in my kind of Weberian inflected thinking a place of verstehen and not a place of erklären. But to see that when cities are taking up an imaginary of innovation, that quite deep-seated infrastructures become the place around which the imagination is made to coalesce. So one very interesting example from our project, not by somebody, one of the core researchers, but she happens to be working on Barcelona, which took on its Silicon Valley, you know, imaginary a number of years ago, but somehow it quickly translated into the Diagonal as being the place where they had to center all of this. So once you see how the street, the road, the flyover, the channels of mobility become a place where new imaginaries of the city are being concentrated, then it ceases to be surprising that the Diagonal, which people say is the life of Barcelona, should be, you know, one of these places, and you become attuned to then seeing how such places and objects might function. I could do a similar riff on trees. I mean, I think there are tree cultures and non-tree cultures, but India happens to be a tree culture where every other tree is a shrine, and you know, build little god seats around them. And the Brits have their interest in trees, but I think it's because of the British obsession with roots.
Yes, Sandra?
Well, I had done some research on the Silicon Wadi, which in Israel is Yokneam. And so I'm wondering, also the road, the main highway, and the mayor, I was in his office when they came in, the engineers, the state engineers came into his office and asked him to sign off on the road. This guy, no education, you know. Anyway, so my question is, the whole town is totally invested in this imaginary, the high tech, the Silicon Valley. It's there. I started working there in the first company that was there, and it's taken off and it's grown, and the whole town has bought into it. The education system, everything. So, must there be conflict? Must there be losers? Must there be? Could there be an imaginary that everyone buys into and everyone is smiling, and they don't care if the trees are knocked down for the road or to build another big metallic building, and the schools and all the services, and they get the benefits?
Well, this is a little bit like asking, once we've perfected the technique of gene editing, will there be any sad people anymore? Mm-hmm. I mean, look at actual Silicon Valley, where in California everybody's supposed to be smiling all the time and the sun always shines. Not, but anyway, it's the myth. People go around in cutoffs and sandals, and they get to Google and they get free food, and it's all very beautiful. So lately, people are having to be paid to live far away from work because nobody can afford the housing. There have been bus riots, as you probably know, in San Francisco, from people who see the public bus stops being taken over, the public-private boundary thereby being crossed. So yes, there are winners and losers. I don't know of any project of change that does not produce winners and losers. I would like to see that project. Maybe the Garden of Eden was supposed to be one of those places, but I don't believe that we're particularly close to the second coming of the revival. So in the meantime, in a world where 80 people, I believe, or maybe 60-something, depending on which statistic you believe in, own something like half the wealth of the entire world, are there winners and losers? You bet. I mean, why is MSR India, MSRI, being able to propagate its views? I mean, there is a nation state, sort of, for William Gates, who has a kind of capacity that you and I don't have. Enough people complain about Microsoft and the way that it has disciplined all of our thinking, for you to know very well, even at a sort of low technical, that is everyday, mundane technical level, how not everybody who would like things to be a different way has the capacity to make things be a different way. A lot of people in America right now would like nothing better than to have somebody else be president and think that the political system is antiquated and the electoral college should be done away with and so on. But there's still limits to, what one can do. In the meantime, yeah, I do think that, I think there are places in society where people have acted like it's all marching in lockstep and everybody's happy. It seems to me that in the 50s there was a lot of expose fiction writing about the myth of many of these golden places, like Peyton Place and, the myth of suburbia. So my suspicion is that good ethnography reveals fault lines in most gardens of Eden.
Sandra, let's maybe we should explain a bit
No,
what your plan. No.
Oh,
what your plan is? Not the dispute between you and me. But we do have disagreement about that. what is Yokneam? What is the city of Yokneam? And so it is the Israeli Silicon Valley, right? But it's a city of immigrants who came from Arab countries. Okay, so the city is divided into people who settled in Israel at the beginning of the 20th century, and then those who arrived mass immigration during the 50s. Now the city was had few industries or few factories, very big factories that were owned by the big union labor organization in Israel. And they had very, very strong and well-set social fair plans, benefits, so on and so forth. And they were closed. And then those high-tech companies, organizations came into the city. So the question is whether there are those who were losing something compared to those who got better benefits from the Israeli local Silicon Valley. It is very relevant question when you consider the structure, the social and economic structure of Yokneam. And of course I agree with you.
I was wondering, you seem to be putting the focus or more focus on the limitations or the paucity of the imagination of politically or economically weaker or disenfranchised populations in relation to those resource-rich elites who, you said a few minutes ago, can out-imagine these people quite handily. And what I wanted to ask you is, have you considered the possibility, and have you seen empirically maybe, in one place or another, the idea that there's actually an inverse relationship between the ability to imagine and the ability to apply one's imagination in the real world, and that not being able to do the latter actually increases and enriches the former in ways that are interesting culturally.
So not being able to enact the counter-imagination enriches the dominant imagination? Is that what you mean, or do you mean transforms it?
No, it doesn't enrich in the dominant imagination. It enriches one's own imagination, the imagination which cannot be applied. That's
I think my entire life history at the Kennedy School is an example of that. I think I'm a better thinker for the lack of ability
that's what
to
I was trying to say.
my ideas inside of a very dominant culture.
Right.
So it is that. But these are complicated relationships. One of the things that, first of all, I would say as a starting caveat is that it's not just on a linear scale out-imagine, right? I mean, that is, there, especially in a country as rich and ancient as India, there are enormous imaginative capacities at work which are not necessarily seeking their benefit in the same place. And there's an awful lot of charlatanry that goes by the name religion, but nevertheless there is a spiritual tradition in India that values things differently from what Weber's classic idea of the Protestant ethic valued. So where do you put your resources? And I think that one of the places that one could look at quite instructively is just the very different role the family plays across the advanced industrial world. I mean, in America, there's any number of statistical studies showing that strong families produce more successful children, right? But very little research talking about the kinds of pressures on the family, or at least not a connection. There's lots of research on the family, but for instance, Americans will criticize France for having this overblown public till and, paying way too much money and, not being able to support the budget and having stasis and not enough growth, etc., etc. I mean, there's a whole critique of France, which is the not us for the American mainstream economist. But if you look at France, I mean, it does have a somewhat more sensible electoral system than we just saw. And, not what has struck me in the recent elections about France is it's not just that they happen to have a 2-week cooling off period between the first sort of referendum-like enthusiasm and the then get wise and, make a real choice second bite, but that people in fairly ordinary walks of life, of course it depends where you're from, but they had a strong sensibility that certain things should not be tolerated. And where did they get that from? I mean, there is something to an educational system that is far more egalitarian than ours, for instance, and different kinds of sensitivities to what a family needs in order to thrive and prosper. We've put all our eggs, at least the Republican right has, in this right to life discourse, which is all about forcing people to have babies that they don't want, but no attention then to what happens to that baby after it comes into the world. I mean, so, we flat out rejected things like, minimum benefits for this or that. I mean, to the extent that the Obama administration succeeded in putting some of those into place, the only coherent policy of the Trump administration seems to be get rid of everything that guy did. I mean, just erase it as if it never existed. So, I think that in fact, these questions about where the contradictory imaginations are to be found, what it takes to strengthen them, the fact that innovation is not only in the sphere of making the silicon take over from the biological, but that some of the most successful collective imaginations of how the world should live have been about something radically different, like what should the family of the future look like, and how should we even begin to think about that? I think that it's interesting that Time magazine, when it was trying to pick a man of the 20th century, picked Einstein and Gandhi, because in a sense that speaks to the binary of where is the right kind of imagination to be located. Is it in cracking the secrets of nature, or is it mobilizing society to have an idea of the good, in this case nonviolence, that could itself become a norm that spreads in a different kind of way? But I don't think in a classic innovation textbook or course at HBS or at business school, you will necessarily find the case study of the Gandhi being taught. You may find a case study of Gandhi, but it will be about something else. Or maybe you'll find it about microcredit and not about nonviolence. But, I think that we have to think about those kinds of questions precisely. I do think that if people of goodwill and some intelligence meet resistance, that is often a way of sharpening what one is wanting. It's not necessarily that, bingo, a better thing pops out at the end. It does have to do with, that Thomas Gray's elegy in a country churchyard, and some mute and glorious Milton here may rest, some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. I mean, those were people who had imaginaries, but they weren't able to articulate them. It's not every time that you have a good idea, whether you're a Milton or a bad idea, according to him, about Cromwell, that you're able to realize that there's infrastructural stuff, which is why some of the attention to infrastructure in this talk.
Well, it's late, and this has been a lovely evening. Thank you so much, Sheila.
Thank you.